He was the action star who didn't need to yell. He didn't flex. He didn't pose. He didn't even run. He just stood still, eerily calm until someone made the mistake of stepping too close. Then suddenly, it was over. In the late 80 seconds and early 90 seconds, Steven Seagal wasn't just on movie posters. He was a movement. While others threw flashy kicks or traded one-liners, he walked into a room silent, broke a dozen bones without breaking a sweat, and walked right back out. On screen, he was unshakable, untouchable, unstoppable. But off-screen, that silence masked something far more tragic. Because behind the black belt and the leather jackets was a boy who once struggled just to breathe, a foreigner nearly broken by tradition in a distant land, and a father who quietly watched his family unravel while the cameras rolled. His rise in Hollywood was meteoric, his fall was devastating, and what came after, almost no one talks about. From fame to failure, from dojo floors in Osaka to discount DVD bins, and from global icon to the ghost of a legend, this is the untold story of Steven Seagal. And trust me, it's nothing like the movies. Before we begin, ask yourself this. Which of his films do you still remember vividly? Which scene, that cold stare or wrist lock, still plays in your memory? If he was any part of your youth, even just one unforgettable movie night, hit that like button as tribute to a man who once made silence look dangerous. Now, let's start where no one expected him to begin. Fragile, sick, and gasping for air. Long before the empty dojos, the red carpets, or the box office, millions Steven Seagal was just a little boy lying awake at night, wondering if he'd live to see the morning. Steven Frederick Seagal was born on the 10th of April 1952 in Lansing, Michigan, a place known more for its snow than for stardom. His parents were ordinary people with extraordinary grit. His father, Samuel, was a quiet, disciplined math teacher. His mother, Patricia, worked long shifts as a medical technician, her hands often sore, but her spirit always steady. They didn't come from money. There were no silver spoons or secret doors into fame. The Seagal household was built on sacrifice, penny pinching, and late nights of tired feet and whispered hopes. But what really defined the family wasn't struggle. It was fear. Fear that their son might not survive. From the moment he could crawl, Steven was fighting a battle most people never see. Severe asthma wrapped around his lungs like an invisible vice, a silent, smothering enemy that followed him everywhere. While other kids played tag under the sun, Steven stayed inside, watching, listening, yearning. The buzzing of an inhaler became his lullaby. His mother's footsteps, pacing desperately through the hallway at night, became his soundtrack. There were nights more than a few where Patricia sat right beside his bed, hand on his chest, listening for each strained breath, silently counting, praying he wouldn't stop. Because sometimes he did. And if you've ever watched a child fight for air, not air after a workout, not air after crying, but basic survival, then you understand what Patricia lived through every night. To the kids at school, Steven was the sick one. Too skinny, too slow, too quiet, weak. And once a label like that gets stuck on you, kids never let it go. He was teased, dismissed, left out of games. Not just ignored, mocked. There are some wounds fists can't fix, and Steven collected those early. Not on his body, but underneath it all, buried deep in the quiet rage of not being understood. But the worst part wasn't the taunts or even the asthma. It was the guilt. Even as a child, Steven understood something most adults don't. Every breath he drew, every pill he took, every doctor's visit that drained the family's savings, cost someone else something. His parents didn't complain, but he saw the lines deepen in their faces, the dollars disappear, the dreams held off for someday. That kind of guilt doesn't just shape a person. It builds a fire slow, quiet, and relentless. By the time Steven turned 5, his parents had had enough of watching their son suffer in silence. Michigan's winters, biting and brutal, were choking him. So, in a last gasp act of love, they packed everything and left. They moved to a place with more sun and less suffocation, Fullerton, California. To most people, it was just a shift in climate. To Steven, it was resurrection. He would later call it his rebirth. The warm breeze of California didn't just let him breathe, it set something loose inside him. For the first time, he stepped outside without fear. He could walk, run just a little. The tightness in his chest loosened, and with that came something new. Possibility, But the years of fragility didn't vanish. He remained small, quiet, wary. He knew his body could betray him at any moment, but he also knew something no one else saw what it cost, just to stand on your own. Where most kids sought fun, Steven sought purpose. He began to watch how people moved, how they carried themselves. He listened more than he spoke, and somewhere, deep in that stillness, was the birth of a decision. If strength wasn't going to come to him by nature, he'd tear it from the hands of destiny inch by inch. That burning hunger not to be strong, but to never feel weak again would define the rest of his life. In the years that followed, Steven became obsessed with movement, but not the kind you'd expect. Not touchdowns or baseball swings. He watched old martial arts films, read dusty books about warriors, monks, soldiers, men who moved with presence and silence. No screaming, no posturing, just control. In a world that had always seen him as delicate, Seagal became drawn to something very different. Stillness that could break mountains. This wasn't fiction to him, it was survival. The seeds of his future were planted right there in the quiet streets of California, in a boy who hadn't yet spoken loudly but was already building a legend in silence. By the time he was a teenager, Steven wasn't the same timid child. His illness still lingered, threatening every now and then, but more and more, he was meeting it head-on, studying martial arts, experimenting with different styles, showing early signs of an almost unnatural confidence when it came to physical movement. But it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about taking back control of the only thing he could, his body. The same lungs that once betrayed him were growing stronger with every breath. The same frame once considered too thin now held beneath it a will most people would break trying to match. Whatever the world took from Steven Seagal as a child, he remembered. He didn't forgive, not entirely. He simply stored it, one layer at a time. Until he became the kind of man whose silence wasn't a weakness anymore. It was a warning. But rebirth in California wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. Because soon, the boy who once couldn't run without gasping would step onto a plane to the far side of the world, chasing warriors, tradition, and something far more dangerous than a fight, respect. By the time he was in his early 20s, Steven Seagal had already survived one battlefield. Most people never walk off from the war against his own body. But survival wasn't enough. He didn't just want to live anymore. He wanted to transcend. And so, in 1974, at the age of just 22, he did something almost unthinkable for an American at that time. He boarded a plane to a place few Westerners understood and even fewer were welcome. Japan. Not for vacation. Not for novelty. He went to fight. Not in a ring, but in a dojo. Not with fists, but with respect. He stepped off the plane not as a star, but as a stranger, thin, quiet, burned by years of isolation but driven by something most people couldn't see. A hunger for mastery. What he found was a world more closed off and unrelenting than anything he had imagined. In the 1,970 seconds, Japan's traditional martial arts culture was sacred, secretive, and fiercely protected. Especially Aikido, an art built around subtlety, flow, and devastating control. Its dojos weren't gyms, they were temples. Its instructors weren't teachers, they were gatekeepers to something deeper than combat, discipline, harmony, and honor. And Americans? They weren't just unwelcome, they were dismissed. Wake, loud, disrespectful, foreigners. When Steven entered Osaka, he was all of that, and he knew it. But he didn't flinch, because inside him lived a truth sharper than any blade. He had already been underestimated his whole life, and Japan was just another proving ground. He began training in a small traditional dojo where nothing came easy, not the language, not the movements, and definitely not the respect. The mats didn't forgive, instructor didn't explain, and classmates didn't hide their contempt. Steven was slammed, hard, daily. Thrown to the floor like a rag doll, trapped in wrist locks that left nerves burning and joints screaming. But worse than the pain was the silence. Cold stares, unspoken laughter, that constant question hanging in the air every time he bowed, why is he here? In that world, bowing wrong could get you humiliated. Asking a question could get you ignored. Reacting too slowly could get you crushed. But quitting? That would get you out. And Seagal did not quit. Day after day, he suited up, white gi eye, bruised ribs, empty stomach, burning pride. He rose early, stayed late, swept floors, cleaned bathrooms, and took punishment most men would call abuse, all just to earn slivers of acceptance. He often referred to that period as being physically broken but spiritually rebuilt. And somewhere in that storm of pain, something shifted. Because the dojo wasn't the only place where fate took notice. It came in the form of a woman, a presence no less powerful than any sensei. Her name was Miyako Fujitani, a black belt, a teacher, and the daughter of one of Aikido's most respected masters. She wasn't just strong, she was formidable. And unlike most around him, she didn't look through Steven. She looked at him. Their meeting wasn't love at first sight. It was deeper than that, more spiritual. Two people bound not by convenience, but by purpose. Through Miyako, the gates began to creak open. She didn't hand him honor, she showed him the pathway to earn it, and Steven followed. He absorbed not just technique, but philosophy, balance, flow, neutrality, movement as reaction, not aggression. Aikido wasn't about overpowering the enemy. It was about neutralizing them without anger, without ego. And for a man who'd grown up beneath the weight of weakness, who had once gasped for every breath, this art wasn't just a physical discipline. It was redemption in motion. The dojo tested him constantly, not just in throws or drills, but in humility. Could he let go of Western pride? Could he stop demanding and start listening? Could he carry the pain without complaint? And the answer slowly, brutally, unmistakably became yes. By the late 1970 seconds, the impossible began to happen. The American once laughed at was now teaching, first assisting, then leading. Eventually, he opened and operated his own dojo in Osaka. Let that sink in. A Westerner running an Aikido dojo in 1970 seconds Japan. That wasn't just rare. That was historic. Even his harshest critics had to admit, Steven Seagal had earned it. Not through charm, not through shortcuts. Through grit, commitment, repetition, endurance. But triumph in Japan wasn't his final destination. The boy who once whispered through asthma attacks, who found his rhythm in silent movement, was no longer content with just mastery. He wanted legacy. Even as he stood on Osaka's tatami mats, his mind drifted westward. Back to America, to the land of cameras, to a stage the size of the world, to Hollywood. He didn't just want to inspire martial artists. He wanted to show the entire world what control, presence, and quiet strength looked like when real. And so, in the early 1980 seconds, Seagal packed up everything again. Not as a failure. This time, as a quiet warrior, returning home not to fit in, but to claim something bigger. But the return to America wasn't triumphant. There was no red carpet waiting in LA, no media buzz, just a struggling dojo, unpaid bills, and a city that didn't care how hard you trained in Japan. In Section 3, Steven Seagal becomes the man Hollywood ignored until he forced them to look. When Steven Seagal stepped back onto American soil in the early 1980 seconds, he brought something no one else had. It wasn't fame. It wasn't money. It wasn't even connections. What he brought back from Japan was something rarer, a level of technical mastery in Aikido so refined, no American actor, stuntman, or director had ever seen it up close before. You'd think that kind of mystique would open doors instantly. It didn't. Instead, Hollywood looked at him and laughed. Tall, thin, ponytailed, controlled. He didn't look like Stallone. He didn't sound like Schwarzenegger. And in the early 80 seconds, nobody in LA knew what the hell Aikido was. A warrior in the wrong city. In 1983, at just 31, Seagal opened a modest dojo with his trusted student Haruo Matsuoka. The location? West Hollywood. And while it might sound impressive, the building was small, tucked away, easy to miss. But inside those four walls were the ghosts of Osaka, the discipline, the pain, the code he had lived by for years. There were no cheering fans, only dust, bills, and near silence. Some weeks, barely a student walked in. He was teaching something most Americans couldn't understand. Aikido didn't punch. It didn't kick. It redirected. It flowed. People didn't come to feel empowered. They came out of curiosity, and many walked out after the first class. "Where's the action?" they would ask. "It's not supposed to look like a dance?" they'd whisper. The same art that had earned Seagal respect in Japan was now being dismissed like it was some off-brand yoga. And every time someone walked out, his financial future walked out with them. Fighting for survival, Steven wasn't living in the hills. He wasn't dining at premiere parties. He was sleeping on the dojo floor some nights, sweeping mats himself, answering phones, managing bills. And often, he couldn't pay them. Rent notices piled up. Utilities hovered on the edge of shutoff. His credit was a joke. His wallet almost empty. He wasn't fighting for martial arts supremacy anymore. He was just trying to not go broke. "I wasn't trying to impress anybody," he would later say. "I was trying to survive." Still, there was something in him that never snapped. That same internal stillness from Japan, the one that helped him endure humiliation and punishment in every tatami dojo, now kept him standing when most men would have walked away. Side hustles and stunt work. But even willpower has bills to pay. So Seagal hustled. Word of his skills started to leak into the film industry, not because of agents or big auditions, but through something else. Stunt coordinators. People behind action scenes. People who knew real from fake. And when they saw what Seagal could do, the speed, the brutal elegance, the wrist locks that snapped grown men into submission without a single punch, they listened. Not producers. Not directors. Stuntmen. The fighters? One of his first gigs came quietly on the challenge. 1,982. Then, in 1983, something bigger. Never Say Never Again, a James Bond film that needed a serious edge. Behind the cameras, Seagal finally had space to demonstrate, to train others, to show them that martial arts in movies didn't have to be ballet with bullets. It could be energy. It could be intimidation and silence. And though the pay wasn't much, it kept food on the table and lights in the dojo. Barely. He was still unknown to the public, still no headliner, but other martial artists started to hear his name. A few actors, a few stuntmen. Whispers, that was all he had. But in LA, that's how legends begin. Every door slammed shut. Seagal wasn't content to teach on set. He wasn't there to prop others up. He wanted the spotlight not for ego, but because he believed what he had spent a lifetime mastering deserved center stage. But Hollywood wasn't biting. When he tried to book meetings, producers shrugged. His ponytail? Unrealistic. His voice? Too cute. His fighting style? Too weird, one exec said. In the age of exaggerated muscle and one-liner superheroes, nobody wanted grounded martial arts from a skinny guy who didn't raise his voice. Every meeting followed the same script. "You're clearly skilled, Mr. Seagal, but we don't see how this sells." Translation? He wasn't marketable. Rock bottom. By the mid-1980 seconds, the dojo was barely staying open. Steven had no health insurance, no savings, often no gas. He was spending what little income he had on broken-down equipment and late rent payments. There were nights when he locked up the dojo, pulled a broom from the closet, and stood there in silence staring at the floor. Not training, just thinking. What if I left everything in Japan for nothing? He had once been one of the only Westerners in martial arts history permitted behind certain closed doors in Osaka. A dojo owner, a father, a husband, a teacher. Now he was just a man sweeping floors at midnight with tears gathering behind tired eyes and a dozen rejection letters still unopened. The world would never see that part of the story, but his students did. They watched him teach even when he had nothing to give. They saw how he trained 3 people like they were a room of 50. That kind of fire doesn't come from ego. It comes from belief. And slowly, that belief began drawing the right kind of attention. A crack in the door. One rumor says it was Michael Ovitz, the powerful Hollywood agent and co-founder of CAA, who stumbled upon him. According to some accounts, Ovitz had invited Seagal to demonstrate in front of a group of industry insiders, half-jokingly wondering if this real martial artist guy could actually throw someone across the room. So Steven stepped up, grabbed a much larger man, and did just that. Hard. No effects. No trick angles. Just force. The room fell silent. Ovitz, a kingmaker in Hollywood, saw not just a fighter. He saw something different. Something dangerous. Something cool. What if there was room in Hollywood for a new kind of warrior? What if you didn't have to yell to dominate? What if silence was the new power? The beginning of something bigger. From that moment, pieces began to fall into place. For the first time, Seagal wasn't viewed as an oddball sideline act. He was seen as a wild card, a new kind of action star that didn't fit the mold. And in 1987, Ovitz helped broker a deal. By 1988, Seagal wasn't just another martial artist teaching in a forgotten building in West Hollywood. He was preparing to star in his first movie. The man who had swept floors in silence just a year before was now in production for a film that would forever redefine his image and flip the action genre itself on its head. That debut film would hit theaters like an unexpected uppercut in 1988, and overnight, the man who nearly lost it all became the most cold-blooded, soft-spoken, and mesmerizing action hero Hollywood had ever seen. In the next section, he explodes onto the scene with Above the Law, and the world would never look at him or action stars the same way again. When Steven Seagal stepped onto the set of Above the Law in 1987, he wasn't a movie star. He wasn't even an actor. He was a martial artist with zero on-screen charisma, at least on paper. No extensive training in drama, no leading man reputation, no Hollywood polish. But that was exactly the point. Because when the film dropped in 1988, something unbelievable happened. Audiences didn't see an actor trying to play tough. They saw a man who looked like he had actually lived it. The unexpected debut of a deadly presence. Above the Law introduced the world to Nico Toscani, a former CIA operative turned renegade cop. But more importantly, it introduced the world to Seagal's style, a new kind of action hero that didn't yell, posture, or throw haymakers for fun. Instead of machine gun bravado, he was cool, methodical, effortless. His movements were sharp, precise, unpredictable, scary in how calm they were. While other action stars huffed, bled, and barreled through set pieces, Seagal merely waited for someone to blink. And by the time they did, it was over. A different kind of warrior. The 80 seconds were crowded with hyper-macho megastars. Schwarzenegger had size. Stallone had grit. Van Damme had flexibility. But Seagal? Seagal had silence. His confidence wasn't loud. It was menacingly still. That ponytail, that slow walk, that cold stare. He wasn't trying to win the fight. He was trying to end it before it even started. And he did, with a flick of the wrist. A brutal throw, a joint lock that made you wince before the stuntman even hit the floor. This wasn't Bruce Lee's ballet. It wasn't Van Damme's ballet-like splits. Seagal made violence feel real ugly, quick, efficient. A martial artist, not a movie star. What made all of this work? He wasn't pretending. Seagal's fight scenes didn't rely on wire work or stunt doubles. Every technique he used came from years of actual training, rooted in Japanese Aikido and battlefield disarms. Unlike other stars who trained in martial arts to look like fighters, Seagal was quite literally the real thing. When he grabbed a man's wrist, you believed it would snap. When he dropped someone on a car hood, you knew it hurt. Even Hollywood insiders were stunned. Here was a guy who had taught CIA agents, ran a dojo in Osaka, trained bodyguards, and he was doing his own stunts, his own choreography, and making everyone else look just a little too polished. Audiences went crazy. Critics were divided. Performances? Meh. Dialogue? Wooden. But you couldn't ignore the screen presence. Every time Seagal stepped into frame, your eyes followed. He wasn't good in the traditional sense. He was dangerous. A blueprint that ignited an empire. The success of Above the Law opened the floodgates. 1 year later, in 1990, Seagal unleashed not one, but 2 films back-to-back, Hard to Kill, Marked for Death. Both were raw, intense, and unflinching in tone street-level tales of revenge, corruption, and violence. And in them, Seagal evolved further into his now iconic persona, the calm killer with nothing to lose. He didn't chase explosions. He walked through them. He didn't beg for justice, he delivered it. With bone-snapping efficiency and ice-cold eyes, he brought martial arts back into Hollywood's bloodstream, not as a novelty, but as dominance. And audiences ate it up. Hard to Kill opened at #1 at the box office. Marked for Death followed a similar path. And just like that, Seagal was no longer an underdog. He was a household name, a bona fide box office draw. Out for Justice. The legend gets darker. In 1991, he dropped Out for Justice, arguably his grittiest performance yet. Set in Brooklyn, the film tossed aside the usual polished action setup. It was raw, violent, and dirty, almost a character study in rage, disguised as a revenge movie. In it, Seagal played Detective Gino Felino, a man born from the streets, speaking with a Brooklyn accent and executing justice on his terms. It didn't just continue his legacy, it cemented it. By now, every Seagal film shared a few key ingredients: His character had a tragic past. He didn't seek out fights, they came to him. He'd warned someone once, and when violence erupted, it was over in seconds. Ruthless efficiency had become his signature. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't even particularly kind, but he was terrifyingly effective. Audiences respected it because they felt it. Enter Under Siege, the crown jewel. By 1992, Hollywood had fully embraced Seagal as weird, emotionless, and intense as he was. And it all peaked with Under Siege. The story? Simple. A disgraced Navy SEAL turned cook. Terrorists hijack a US battleship. Big mistake. As Casey Ryback, Seagal delivered everything his fans had come to love, but with just enough craft to pull broader audiences in. It wasn't just a hit, it was a monumental success. The numbers? $156 million worldwide. Nominated for 2 Academy Awards, widely hailed as one of the best action thrillers of the decade. Seagal wasn't just part of the action genre anymore. He was shaping it. Ironically, the quietest man in the room had now become Hollywood's loudest action voice. A new kind of action star. The irony of Seagal's success was how anti-Hollywood he truly was. He wasn't charming. He wasn't funny. He rarely smiled on camera. He didn't want to be in an ensemble. He didn't want equal screen time. He didn't even want his characters to lose ever. And yet, he worked. His fight scenes reflected a deeper philosophy, one rooted in real-world efficiency. He didn't block a punch, he redirected it. He didn't swing wildly, he used angles. He didn't waste energy, he controlled the center. This wasn't made for teenage hype, this was lethal mechanics. Action fans loved it because it felt different. It felt smart, like the kind of man who entered rooms already having calculated exactly how many people he had to break before he walked out. In many ways, Seagal made being calm look terrifying, something no one else in his era dared to attempt. Standing among giants. By the early 90 seconds, Seagal stood tall. Right next to Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Van Damme, he had become Hollywood royalty. His name alone sold tickets. His silhouette alone filled posters. Studios lined up for projects. His style of combat started bleeding into other films. Even video games began modeling characters after his stillness, his snapping strikes, and his stone-faced demeanor. For a boy who once watched the world through a hospital window, he had become the man the world couldn't look away from, the threat of the spotlight. But there was something darker moving beneath the surface. Because while his on-screen image was controlled, behind the scenes, Seagal had begun to show signs of personal unrest, creative clashes, script disagreements, a growing ego fueled not by arrogance, but by ambition and insecurity. Pressure he'd buried for decades was starting to leak out. He wasn't just playing the role of a man in control. He was trying to hold everything together: fame, family, finances, and the cracks were starting to show. But for now, the legend was at its peak. But the higher the climb, the harder the fall. And Steven Seagal was about to learn that success in Hollywood is never permanent. In Section 5, we explore the storm that was waiting just beyond the spotlight, a series of missteps, failed experiments, and harsh betrayals that would strip him of everything he fought so hard to build. By the time 1994 rolled around, Steven Seagal wasn't just a star. He was an industry. He'd gone from sleeping in his dojo to headlining 5 massive box office hits in just 6 years. Each one faster, deadlier, more iconic than the last. And then, he did the one thing the industry feared. He took control. Not over stunts, not choreography. He took the director's chair. And that's when everything began to burn. On Deadly Ground, a passion project or critical suicide, Steven Seagal's directorial debut was 1994's On Deadly Ground. On the surface, it looked like everything fans would want. Explosions? Arctic oil rig setting? Sharon Stone-level co-star? Seagal doing what Seagal does best, breaking bad guys in two? But then the movie started talking. And people weren't ready for what it had to say. Because tucked between every bone-crunching fight and oil-field blaze was something else. Environmentalism. Themes about pollution, corporate greed, destruction of native land. A closing monologue longer than the final fight sequence. Seagal bloodied and bruised, lecturing an audience on climate change with all the intensity of a UN summit. This wasn't just another vigilante flick. This was Steven Seagal trying to become something else. A messenger, a philosopher, a voice far beyond action. But the world didn't want enlightenment. They wanted elbows to the face and quick exits. So when On Deadly Ground finally hit theaters, it didn't just disappoint, it imploded. The public backlash. Critics were savage. They called it tone deaf, preachy, a vanity project without self-awareness. One even wrote, Seagal is trying to be Gandhi with a grenade launcher. It was clear, people didn't come to hear him preach, they came to see him punish. And studios took notice. The box office numbers reaffirmed what the critics had shouted. Audiences weren't showing up, the warrior had overreached, and Hollywood was pulling the rug. To Seagal, this wasn't just a flop, this was personal. That movie was from my heart, he later said. Maybe I tried to say too much. Or maybe no one wanted to listen. The shifting industry. But Seagal's decline wasn't solely about one movie. The 1,990 seconds were changing. Audiences were turning toward a new kind of hero. Funnier, vulnerable, quirky, human. Think. Bruce Willis in Die Hard, Keanu Reeves in Speed, even Will Smith stepping into sci-fi blockbusters with charm and charisma. In short, Hollywood no longer wanted stone-faced warriors. They wanted guys who could make you laugh, bleed, and flirt sometimes, all in the same scene. Seagal wasn't adapting, he was doubling down. Still stoic, still serious, still invincible. And people were getting tired of it. Under Siege 2. But lightning didn't strike twice. In an effort to rekindle what worked, Seagal quickly followed up with Under Siege 2, Dark Territory, 1995, easily the most high-profile sequel of his career. But the spark had faded. This time, the villain was weaker, the action less grounded, and the magic of Ryback barely there. Seagal looked heavier, slower, and somehow harder to believe. It was watchable, but forgettable. For a franchise that had once drawn Oscar nominations, the follow-up felt like a studio obligation, not an artistic comeback. Audiences sensed it, critics smelled it, and box office receipts didn't lie. Under Siege 2 made money, but nowhere near the empire-building numbers of its predecessor. Even worse, people didn't talk about it. And for Seagal, silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. The death blow. Executive decision. In 1996, Seagal signed onto Executive Decision alongside Kurt Russell, perhaps hoping to rebrand himself to a broader audience. It seemed like a smart move. Big budget, ensemble cast, terrorist hijacking plot. The kind of political action suspense people were loving. But what happened on screen shocked everyone, especially Seagal's fans. His character Dees, within the first 30 minutes, no comeback, no twist, gone. Thrown into an airlock and sucked out mid-flight. Audiences were stunned. Not because of the narrative choice, but because it symbolized something much bigger. Seagal was no longer untouchable. He could disappear. He could be replaced. After years of dominance, of walking away from fireballs in slow motion, Hollywood just blew him out of the sky and didn't even blink. Straight to DVD, the new reality. By the late 90 seconds, Seagal was no longer being discussed for blockbuster roles. His scripts weren't landing in theaters. They were going direct to DVD without fanfare or budget. Fire down below. The Patriot. Ticker. Belly of the Beast. Titles started blending together, same outfits, same plot lines, same unkillable Seagal wreaking havoc in different countries with increasingly generic bad guys. The movies became punchlines, cue cheap explosions, dubbed lines, forced body doubles, badly lit fights, and suddenly, the greatest warrior in Hollywood felt like a ghost trapped in B-movie purgatory. It wasn't even about acting anymore. It was survival. Quantity over quality, output over artistry. And for a man who once redefined the genre, that shift wasn't just a career decline. It was a humiliation. The media turns on him. As the movies faded, the tabloid spotlight flared up. Whispers became headlines, wild behavior on set, accusations of ego and outbursts, legal issues, financial problems, allegations of mistreatment toward co-stars and crew. Late night, hosts began taking cheap shots, magazine covers mocked his weight, red carpet invites slowly stopped coming. He was no longer feared, no longer admired. He was being laughed at, pushed out of the very empire he built. And even then, he kept working. Because Steven Seagal didn't know how to walk away. Not from the dojo, not from the fall, not from anything. A warrior's reflection. Years later, when asked about that era, Seagal didn't lash out. He didn't point fingers, attack studios, or blame Hollywood. He said simply, "One day, you're on a 30-foot poster outside a theater. Then one day, people walk right past your movie sitting in a bin at the drugstore. That's a pain you don't prepare for." And maybe that's the truth. No amount of martial arts training prepares you for irrelevance, for becoming slowly, publicly forgettable. The first death of the myth. There's something haunting about watching a hero become a cautionary tale, and that's exactly what started to happen. Because for a long time, Steven Seagal represented something real. The strong, silent type, the foreigner who earned respect, the underdog who rose from nothing, the man who could break you without uttering a word. But now, that image started slipping. Underneath the belts and jackets and smirks was a man who had been burned by his own legend. He had flown too high, too fast, for too long. And Hollywood had finally caught up. But as his career slipped away, so did something even more important: his personal life. Family, love, loyalty, those foundational pieces weren't just crumbling, they were collapsing under the weight of absence and ambition. In the next section, we peel back the curtain on the heartbreak behind Seagal's marriages, the silence between him and his children, and the cost of always chasing something bigger. For years, Steven Seagal was the man you didn't mess with, the silent figure lunging through windows, snapping necks with a flick of the wrist, disappearing into shadows without a word. In Hollywood, he was the embodiment of toughness, cold, unfazed, unstoppable. But behind the stoic gaze and martial arts mystique was a truth few ever saw. Steven Seagal spent a lifetime fighting for recognition, respect, and legacy. But in chasing all those things, he lost what mattered most. The hearts that once waited for him, the homes he built, then walked away from, the family he watched through rearview mirrors. Because even warriors come home tired. And sometimes, they don't come home at all. A marriage born in the dojo. It began in Japan. Not in Hollywood. Not in the action star glow, but in the quiet, white-walled halls of an Osaka dojo. That's where he met Miyako Fujitani, the poised, powerful daughter of a respected Aikido master. She wasn't dazzled by him. She wasn't seduced by status. He had none. What she saw was a man trying to belong, a foreigner refusing to quit, a fighter with more wounds than muscle. She believed in him before the world ever would. Their relationship was forged not on red carpets, but on battered mats, in silent discipline, in early mornings and respect-filled bows. They trained together, taught together, built a future in small, sacred steps. Eventually, they married. 2 children followed, a son and a daughter. And for a while, Steven Seagal had something rare: balance, family, purpose, peace. But ambition doesn't rest, especially not in men raised in struggle. The distance that devoured a union. In the early 80 seconds, Hollywood called, not loudly, not with promises, whispers, opportunities the kind that fade if you don't chase them fast, and Steven chased. He left for America, carrying decades of martial discipline and the distant dream of stardom. He planned to bring Miyako and the kids later, once things were stable. Once the dojo in LA was running. Once the right job hit, but months turned into a year fell into 2. Letters slowed, phone calls missed their time zones. Miyako, now alone in Osaka, raised 2 children in a home they once dreamed would be a fortress of unity. Instead, it became her burden, her battlefield. And for Steven, the silence started creeping in. He was consumed by the struggle of keeping a business alive, by the hunger to rise, by the urgent need to prove everything he'd once been ridiculed for. He wasn't trying to hurt his family, he was trying to succeed for them. But in doing so, he became a name on the phone, a photo on the shelf, a man his children only knew at a distance. Eventually, the marriage collapsed. Not through betrayal, not through shouting matches. It ended in quiet heartbreak, stretched across thousands of miles. They signed the papers. He never moved back. Years later, he would say, "I wanted the world, but in chasing it, I lost the people who mattered most." The second try, Adrienne LaRussa. Soon after, Seagal found himself in another relationship, Adrienne LaRussa, an actress known for her grace on camera and poise off it. A different kind of woman, a different kind of marriage. And this time, Steven didn't start from nothing. He was on the cusp of his big break, rising, recognized, balancing dojo classes with stunt work and studio pitches. Maybe he thought love would anchor him. Maybe she did too. But their marriage, though official, barely made it through a single season. They separated within the first year. No children, no tabloids, just silence. Some relationships leave scars. This one left questions. What went wrong? According to Seagal, it wasn't the people, it was the timing. In an interview, he admitted, "I was searching for peace in the wrong places. When you do that, nothing lasts." This time, he didn't even pretend to look back. The fairy tale that fell apart Kelly LeBrock. Then came what looked, at least from the outside, like destiny. Kelly LeBrock, a model, a movie star, a woman whose name already carried global weight before she ever crossed paths with Seagal. She was beauty, he was the brood. She brought red carpets. He brought martial mystique. In the late 80 seconds, their worlds collided, and for a brief moment, everything felt cinematic. They were Hollywood's golden couple. Flashbulbs, magazine covers, mansion parties, luxury and love dancing in the same spotlight. Their marriage wasn't quiet, especially after they had 3 children together. For a while, it looked like Seagal had finally found his center, a home filled with laughter, small hands clinging to his jeans, sleepy bedtime stories, a family gathered around morning pancakes. But then the spotlight got brighter, and the shadows got longer. Whispers in the light. As Seagal's career soared with Hard to Kill, Out for Justice, and Under Siege, so did the demands. More filming, more travel, more time in trailers and hotel suites than in dining rooms or backyards. And then came the rumors of affairs, of distance, of secrets kept behind stylists and security teams. Some were baseless Hollywood tailoring its favorite drama, the crumbling fairy tale. But others hurt. Kelly started showing up to events alone. Interviews turned colder. Her presence dimmed. Inside their mansion, the absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. And in their children's eyes, it was confusion. Who was dad? Really? The silent storm on screen? The stranger in the hallway? The face that waved goodbye more than it said goodnight? Eventually, everything collapsed. Divorce in the traffic cameras. In 1994, the same year, On Deadly Ground hit theaters and started Seagal's creative fall. His marriage also detonated. There was no discreet exit. It came with tabloid headlines, custody fights, property disputes, dollar signs, and heartbreak in the same legal documents. Kelly gained full custody of the kids. She said in later interviews that leaving wasn't revenge, it was survival. For herself, for the children. She described it as being alone even when someone else was in the room. Seagal, years later, confessed, "I lost things I can never get back. Not contracts, not awards, memories, moments, trust, the invisible damage." Across 3 marriages, Seagal had 7 children. And while public breakdowns made headlines, what didn't get aired were the birthdays missed, the piano recitals unexplained, the silence that sits heavier at a dinner table when someone is supposed to be sitting there. His kids? Most never spoke publicly. And maybe that says more than words can. There's pride, yes. They saw Casey Ryback, Nico Toscani, the action star, the fighter. But they also saw the missed calls, the distance, the way stardom sometimes steals a father before it even steals applause. Steven always said family mattered most. But with fame, time becomes currency and hours lost don't come back. A new kind of love. Years later, in the quiet ebb of his stardom, Seagal met Erdnatuya El Batsuk, a Mongolian-born dancer and interpreter. She wasn't Hollywood. She wasn't chasing premieres or portfolios. She was calm, and by all accounts, she saw Steven the man, not the icon. They moved slowly, built trust, and eventually married. Together, they had a son, Kunzang. By then, Seagal was in his 50s. Older, heavier, keter, still filming but more often at home. Not in LA, in Arizona, far away from neon dreams and broken contracts. This marriage, perhaps, was not starstruck romance, but rather a steady hand after a storm. A father once more. With Kunzang, Seagal had a chance to do something he rarely could during his rise. Be there. And while nothing fills the vacancies left behind in other relationships, in other childhoods, This time, he tried to stay present. Pickups, hugs, simple routines, a world without premieres. Just presence. He still carried regret by his own admission. But now, sitting on a porch with the sun nearby, the noise finally gone, perhaps he understood something fame could never teach. You can earn millions, break bones, conquer charts, but if your child won't call you today, what was the point? Reflections and regret. Every interview from Seagal in his later years reveals a pattern. Less bravado, more pause, more reflection. He talks about missed birthdays more than movie premieres. He admits, often quietly, fame took me everywhere, except where I really needed to be, home. It's hard to look at his life and not feel the weight of that sentence. Because the real collapse of Steven Seagal's empire didn't happen in theaters. It happened at home, in the spaces where laughter once lived, in the rooms that echoed louder without him, in the children who waited, wondered, and eventually stopped asking. With Hollywood now behind him, and his personal life marked with scars that time won't entirely heal, Seagal turned to something new. Business ventures. Music, fragrances, energy drinks, video games. Each one was a shot at reinvention, only they didn't land the way he hoped. In our next section, we explore Seagal's desperate attempts to rebuild an empire, one product, one performance, one last chance at relevance at a time. When the cameras stop rolling, the silence gets loud. For Steven Seagal, that silence became deafening. He had built his entire life on momentum, on being the storm that no one saw coming. And for a while, that worked. But now, the storm had passed. The audience had moved on. So the question was no longer, what's your next film? It was, is this how it ends? Seagal was never the type to fade quietly. And when Hollywood turned the page, he refused to go with it. Instead, he pivoted. If the screen didn't want him, he'd build something else. An empire beyond cinema. But what followed wouldn't be a comeback. It would be something crueler. An era of reinvention, ridicule, and rejection. The energy drink that fizzled. It started with a gamble, not on a roll. On a can. In the early 2000s, Seagal launched what he believed would be his new legacy. Steven Seagal's Lightning Bolt energy drink. The name alone sounded like it had come straight from a discarded script. The can promised raw, natural energy, increased focus and stamina, Asian herbs, hand-picked by monks. Seriously? It came in flavors like Asian Experience and Cherry Charge. He appeared in infomercials, smiling stiffly, sipping his concoction with deadly seriousness. But the reviews were brutal. People didn't just call it bad, they called it undrinkable. Some said the taste felt like it held a grudge against your tongue. Others joked it should come with a health warning or a waiver. Stores stopped stocking it. Cans started appearing on eBay as gag gifts. And just like that, Lightning Bolt became another entry on the ever-growing list of celebrity products that no one asked for and everyone laughed at. For a man who once commanded theaters, having your face on a drink mocked in YouTube taste tests, that stings in a different way. The game that never happened. A few years later, Seagal tried again, this time in a different arena. Video games. In the late 90 seconds, concept art and industry whispers began circulating about an upcoming project titled Deadly Honor, the Steven Seagal video game. The pitch? You, the player, step into Seagal's shoes and unleash his unique fighting style in a gritty, morally complex world full of conspiracies and corrupt institutions. It actually sounded promising. A grounded, hand-to-hand combat system centered on real martial arts instead of fantasy. Something different from hyper-violent, over-the-top action. But somewhere deep in development, it collapsed. No trailer was ever released. No official gameplay ever surfaced. No release date, no follow-up. It just vanished. Years later, Seagal commented, "I thought it would be a new way for people to learn who I really am. The philosophy, the art, not just the violence. When the project disappeared, it felt like the rug was pulled out from under me." Another illusion of a comeback. Another ghost added to the growing graveyard of Seagal, ventures that never quite made it, the fragrance that nobody wanted. Not long after, Seagal unveiled a different kind of signature product. Scent of Action, yes, a cologne. Marketed as evoking power, dominance, and lethal calm, the fragrance came in a metallic bottle shaped like a blade handle, boxed in matte black and red with his signature in silver. The campaign was dead serious. The public was not. Comedians, reviewers, and influencers tore it to shreds. One joked it smelled like hotel carpet and smoke from bad direct-to-DVD fireballs. Another said it was what regret would smell like if it had a musk. The internet didn't forgive. And the scent? Faded. Just like the product, the smell disappeared into obscurity. Merchandise and mockery. The following years brought more attempts. Limited edition katana sets, autographed martial arts DVDs, autobiographical novels ghostwritten but proudly marketed, even a Seagal survival knife, endorsed as the last tool you'll ever need. But with every new launch came wider ridicule. The world no longer saw Seagal as a master of calm destruction. They saw a meme. Reddit threads joked about his one expression. YouTube channels compiled clips of his immortal swagger. His calories and camera angles in newer films became more relevant than the plots themselves. The man who once taught deadly techniques to CIA agents now had reaction videos of teenagers mocking his fight scenes. Somewhere along the way, the legend had been replaced with parody, and no product line could cover that, the house that wouldn't sell. Then came the blow that didn't land in a review section, but in real life. Tennessee. In the early 2000s, Seagal had bought a sprawling estate there. A grandiose property once valued around $3.9 million, complete with vast woodlands, custom floors, guest houses, and a personal dojo. It was supposed to be a symbol, a throne, a monument, a reward for surviving Hollywood. But as the years wore on, the property became a financial nightmare. Buyer didn't come, property taxes accumulated. The market cooled faster than his box office draw. Eventually, out of options, he sold it for just over $1 million. Barely a quarter of its original value. The house didn't just fail commercially, it failed emotionally. That was supposed to be home. Instead, it became a receipt, proof that nothing lasts. That all empires, no matter how dangerous they once looked, crumble from within. Still trying to be heard. Even amid the failures, Seagal refused to disappear. He kept touring internationally for martial arts seminars. He released not one, but 2 blues albums, songs from The Crystal Cave and Mojo Priest. He appeared in reality TV, like Steven Seagal, lawman, portraying himself as a real-life sheriff. And again, he was mocked. But each time, he returned. Each time, he showed up. Even if the crowd had changed from movie execs to internet skeptics, he remained committed to being seen. Because irrelevance, for a man who once stood atop cinema's peak, is heavier than any stack of bad reviews. He wasn't chasing fame for ego anymore. He was chasing it because it was all he had left, from icon to meme. The saddest part? He knew. He knew how the world viewed him, how the critics buried him, how the industry pretended it never needed him, how the fans who once cheered now laughed. And yet, he kept holding on. He kept creating, launching, releasing. Not because he thought every product would be a success, but because he couldn't accept the silence. When asked why he continued putting himself out there, he replied, "Because I still have something to say, even if no one's listening the same way." When the stage goes quiet, not every fall is fast. Some happen in slow motion, day by day, as the audience shrinks and the spotlight slips an inch further away. That's the fall of Steven Seagal. Not with a scandal, not with a tragedy, but with time, with trial, with attempts that didn't land. He didn't crash, he faded. In a way, that's even harder. Because while some stars exit on their own terms, Seagal fought to stay visible until the curtain finally closed. And in doing so, he became not just an actor who peaked, but a symbol of how painfully cruel reinvention can be. When the world has already decided your best days are behind you, every new project becomes a stage not for success, but for spectacle. So what happens when even reinvention fails? When the products run dry, the songs are forgotten, and no studio answers your calls? For Seagal, the final chapter wasn't fame or fire or fortune. It was something quieter, something far more powerful than applause. Acceptance. In the next and final act of his story, we step into the desert fortress he now calls home and discover a man learning, after everything, to finally just be. After decades of fame, failure, reinvention, and ridicule, Steven Seagal now lives behind silence. Not the cinematic kind, the silence that comes at the end of applause. At 71 years old, Seagal keeps his distance from the world that once crowned him Hollywood's most fearsome warrior. He no longer walks red carpets. He no longer breaks box office records. And perhaps most quietly of all, he no longer tries to prove anything. Because for a man who once fought everyone on screen and off, there's one final battle left to face: himself. The fortress in the desert. Seagal now resides in Arizona, on the edge of the desert, a place known for stillness, extremes, and the kind of emptiness that whispers a lot more than it speaks. His home isn't modest. It's not just a house, it's a fortress. Walls reinforced with bulletproof glass percetive, Liberdat rescissions, statues of samurai warriors, lining silent hallways, an infinity pool that stretches toward the mountains, rooms decorated like the set of a classic martial arts. Epic. To the outside world, it might seem like excess. Toe Steven. It's armor. This estate isn't opulence, it's a refuge. A reminder of who he was. A safe place from who he became. Because after everything behind success, behind scandal, behind the weight of being a walking myth, the man needed something that didn't move beneath his feet. A final battleground no one else could touch. A legacy of pieces. Seagal's career didn't vanish, it splintered. Dozens of films still live in bargain bins. Clips of his fluid Aikido movements flood YouTube. Countless martial artists still call him sensei. His name, even mocked, still feels familiar in the culture. He built a legacy not in one masterpiece, but in 1,000 fragments, some brilliant, some broken, all undeniably his. And for a while, he tried to hold it all together. With music. With products. With appearances. But today, much of that is over. You won't find him chasing interviews. You won't see him campaigning for relevance. He's not trying to come back. He's trying to remember who he really was before everything got loud. The body tells the story. There's a truth. Every action star learns. Eventually, what lifts you up eventually wears you down, and the body always keeps the receipts. Decades of martial arts, filming, stunt work, it all adds up. Today, his movements are slower, his body heavier, knees stiff, joints aching, shoulders reluctant. Even standing too long looks uncomfortable. The throws he once executed on concrete are now replaced with tender steps. The speed that defined him has surrendered to caution. But here's the quiet miracle. He still moves. With braces, with stretches, with help. But he moves. Even if the world stopped watching. This isn't failure, it's humanity. You don't spend 40+ years colliding with men, concrete floors, and explosive props without a cost. And instead of denying it, Seagal finally seems to accept it. You can't bring it all back, he once said, but you learn to be grateful for what's still there. A new kind of strength. In his youth, Seagal sought power from movement, from dominance, from silence that cut deeper than a shout. Now, his strength is Keter. It shows up in mornings where he still practices Aikido not as a weapon, but as meditation. Light forms, breathwork, discipline. It shows in how he treats food understanding now that his machine needs fuel, not fire. He's not chasing immortality, he's simply trying to feel whole. There's dignity in that kind of transformation. And for someone whose name once meant indestructible, it turns out the most powerful thing he could ever become is at peace. A son late in life. Of all the things Seagal chased, fame, mastery, strength, recognition, family was the one that always slipped through his fingers. But in his later years, something unfamiliar entered his life. A new beginning. With Erdanatuya El Batsuk, a Mongolian-born ballroom dancer and interpreter, Seagal found not just admiration but unwavering stillness. She wasn't dazzled. She wasn't clinging to his past. She simply said, "I see you." Together, they had a son, Kunzang. For a man who missed so much of his other children's milestones, birthdays, dances, hugs, tears, this late gift of fatherhood came at a time when he could do what he never could before: be present. They live together now in Arizona. Quiet mornings, shared meals, long walks, not the kind of memories that make headlines, but the kind that stay buried in the heart long after the world forgets your name. The other children ghosts in the frame. Seagal has 7 children in total from multiple marriages. And while his youngest son lives with him, the others live with distance. Some are grown now. Parents themselves. Children of the mythology raised alongside movies and magazine covers, but often outside the warmth of proximity. They rarely speak about their father. Not in anger, but in absence. Interviews are sparse. Social media footprints minimal. It's unclear if the relationships are fractured or simply faded. But one thing's certain, they remember. The fame, the travel, the gaps in the table. Seagal has admitted more than once that those were the real losses. Not roles, not royalties, but the moments erased for ambition. And he carries those memories now not as regrets he can change, but as truths he can finally sit with. The final mirror. Seagal now watches his older films less like trophies and more like messages from a younger man he barely recognizes. The jawline, the confidence, the surge of action, it's all still there digitally preserved. But the man who lives in the quiet halls of his Arizona home doesn't chase that anymore. He isn't trying to rewind or resurrect, only to remind himself that it's okay to become something else. Because in a world obsessed with youth and virality, it takes an enormous act of courage to say, "This is who I am now," and mean it. The empire that died quietly. There are no more press tours, no more premieres, no demand for his next blockbuster. But the empire Seagal built did exist. A box office run that rivaled the biggest names, martial arts legitimacy that reshaped Hollywood choreography, philosophies that fused Eastern calm with Western action. A persona so specific, it became cultural shorthand. And yes, even the ridicule, the parody, the jokes prove that he mattered. Because irrelevance is never being mentioned again. And love him or hate him, Steven Seagal left a mark. The piece he never knew he needed. Today, Steven Seagal isn't trying to be your hero. And he's no longer playing one. He cuts tomatoes with the same precision he once blocked knives. He steps down staircases a little slower but still upright. He sips tea instead of kicking down doors. He laughs more, talks less, and stays home. That might feel anticlimactic to some. But to a man who once believed strength came from slamming your enemy to the ground, peace is the final, most impossible victory. Legacy. Finally understood. If we remember Seagal only for Under Siege, we're missing the point. If we remember only the ego, the misfires, the weight gain, the B-movies, and the memes, we're still missing it. Because his legacy isn't about being flawless. It's about being real. He was the timid kid with asthma. He left home chasing breath. He found family, lost them, tried to find them again. He rose, half fell. He kept getting up. And now, as he walks the final miles of a legendary, complicated, and deeply human journey, he's no longer the untouchable warrior. He is the man who survived himself. Maybe you loved his films. Maybe you laughed at them. Maybe you forgot he even existed. But now that you've heard the full story, who is Steven Seagal to you? The hero? The lost soul? The cautionary tale? Or the misunderstood survivor? Drop a comment below. Share your favorite memory, your favorite film, the moment you first saw him flatten a man without blinking. And if he was ever part of your youth, if even one line, one scene, one stare made you sit up a little straighter, leave a like. Not for the superstar, not for the controversy, but for the man, scarred, faded, flawed, still standing.